I want to take you into one of the strangest, most nagging loose ends in the whole Manson family story, the so-called Tex Watson tapes. Let's rewind. These recordings were made back in 1969 and 1970 when Tex was holed up in a Dallas area jail fighting extradition to California. His Texas lawyer, Bill Boyd, had him sit down and record hours of private conversations, talking about his background, his time with Manson and the family, and of course, the Tate LaBianca murders. It was part defense strategy, part insurance policy, a way to preserve Tex's side of the story before a California jury ever saw him. Neither Boyd nor anyone else knew at the time of Watson's arrest on November 30th, 1969, that he would successfully drag out extradition until September 11th, 1970. Now, most accounts say that there were about 8 cassettes or 20 hours of material. 20 hours of Tex before the parole hearings, before the born-again persona, before the carefully polished apologies. These are believed to be his rawest, most unfiltered descriptions of the crimes, and maybe even talk of drug robberies and other violent episodes. This isn't the Tex who played to a parole board. This is the Tex still trying to figure out how to spin his story. After Watson was finally extradited, the tapes stayed locked in Boyd's office. They weren't introduced at trial. They were off limits to the public. And then in the mid-1970s, along comes Chaplain Ray Hoekstra, ministering at the California Men's Colony. By 1978, he and Tex had co-authored Will You Die For Me, a book that, if you've read it, sounds a lot more like a deposition than a memoir. Most researchers believe Boyd gave Hoekstra access to either the tapes or transcripts. Tex wasn't getting his hands on them from behind bars, but the book's narrative arc mirrors what we believe are in those recordings. Hoekstra just added his evangelical gloss over the top. Years later, reporter Tom O'Neill, decades before his book Chaos came out, had been corresponding with Bill Boyd. Boyd hinted more than once that maybe someday he'd share the tapes. And then Bill Boyd died in 2009, and the recordings sat in his firm's files. Normally, that material would have stayed privileged forever. Boyd's law firm, though, went bankrupt in 2012, and suddenly the tapes were in play. O'Neill even reached out to LAPD's Robbery Homicide Division and gave them tips on it, asking, if you get them, will you share them? Now, what followed was almost a custody battle. Watson's own legal team tried to get them and failed, and then LAPD swooped in. A Fort Worth bankruptcy judge signed off, and LAPD detectives flew to Texas and came home with the tapes. The LAPD's Unsolved Homicide Unit listened. Publicly, they said, there's nothing new here. Privately, they'd admitted to victims' family members, including Deborah Tate and Anthony DeMaria, that in those recordings, Watson downplayed the women's roles in the killings. Now, that detail alone could have mattered at parole hearings or even reshaped the official narrative of the family's crimes. That brings us to Leslie Van Houten. Her attorney, Rich Pfeiffer, begged for access to the tapes, arguing they could prove Watson, not Van Houten, drove the violence at Waverly Drive, that he even held a bayonet up to her head, directing her to stab Rosemary LaBianca after the victim was already deceased. A Los Angeles judge reviewed the transcript, 326 pages, and kept it sealed. Pfeiffer never got to use it, even while the parole board grilled Van Houten about remorse and responsibility. Think about that. On the one hand, LAPD admits the tapes show Watson minimizing the women's roles. On the other, they fight tooth and nail to keep that evidence out of the very hearings where Van Houten and Patricia Krenwinkel needed it most. And here we are, more than a decade later, with LAPD still refusing every California Public Records Act request. Their excuse? Releasing the tapes would, quote unquote, interfere with an investigation. That sounds like there's an active case still tied to the Manson family, 50 plus years on. Sometimes that's legit. You don't want to blow an unsolved homicide. But Tate LaBianca was solved in 1970. So what investigation are we really talking about? My guess? It's not about new leads. It's about LAPD keeping control of material that could be embarrassing, inconvenient, or even poke holes in the Helter Skelter story. As long as they can label it under investigation, they can slam the door on every request. And people have tried. The Associated Press filed a California Public Records Act request. So did the Los Angeles Times, and both were denied. LAPD used the same excuse each time. The tapes are part of an ongoing investigation. It's the catch-all exemption that lets them shut down outside scrutiny, even though we're talking about murders prosecuted more than half a century ago. If the press can't get access, you can bet individuals will hit the same brick wall, which is exactly why we need to keep pushing, but in a different way. So what can we do? Push for metadata, not the tapes themselves, but the paperwork around them. Chain of custody logs, transfer memos, correspondence between LAPD and the DA. CPRA requires agencies to release non-exempt portions of records even if part is redacted. If enough people file carefully worded requests, LAPD might have to cough up at least something. Dates, page counts, who had access. And that something could be used to leverage more. Now, back to Ray Hoekstra. His reputation in the 70s and 80s rested on his credibility as a Christian minister. After Will You Die For Me came out, he toured churches using Watson's conversion as an example of God's grace. For him, the whole project depended on Watson's account being complete. To put his own name on a book that concealed additional murders would have gutted his ministry. That's why it's unlikely Hoekstra ever believed Watson confessed to more murders than those he was convicted of. He trusted the material he had, almost certainly transcripts of the Boyd tapes, and believed it told the whole story. That's why he was willing to stand behind it in print and at pulpits. Now, could Watson have hinted about other murders or about family members' crimes beyond Tate LaBianca? Maybe. But Hoekstra's entire career suggests he wouldn't have looked the other way. If anything, he framed Watson's testimony as a complete confession, the very thing that made his redemption story so powerful, a story of grace. What I'd love to know is whether the tapes include more about July 1st, 1969, the drug burn and shooting of Bernard Latsapapa Crow, as well as the events of April 13th, 1969, when Watson allegedly robbed and shot Joel Rostow, a drug dealer. Those crimes hang in the shadow of the family narrative, and the tapes could shed light there. But here's what I think is the real smoking gun. The importance of these tapes may not be what Tex said or what Hoekstra published, but what the LAPD failed to do. Why did it take Susan Atkins bragging in a jail cell for detectives to connect the family to the Tate or LaBianca murders? Why did it take that kind of fluke when evidence already existed pointing at Manson's group? If the tapes prove anything, it's that from the very beginning, the police had pieces of the puzzle but failed to put them together. That failure left the field wide open for myth, manipulation, and decades of unanswered questions. The LAPD has a long history of protecting its own reputation, even when it meant stonewalling the truth. From the suppression of the bloody Christmas police beatings in 1951, investigated only after public outcry, to the cover-ups during the 1990s Rampart scandal, where officers' perjury and brutality were buried until whistleblowers forced exposure. Each time, the department's first instinct was to preserve institutional credibility rather than face accountability. With that track record, it's not surprising they'd keep the Tex Watson tapes sealed if releasing them risked undermining the official Helter Skelter narrative or discrediting themselves, even investigations decades old and officially solved. So the Tex Watson tapes aren't just about Tex, and they're not even just about Charles Manson or the family or the murders of 1969. They're also about the LAPD and what the public has the right and the responsibility to know. In the comments below this video, you'll find an example letter you can send to LAPD's custodian of records. If enough of us ask, we may get a response. And just maybe, we can compel them to give us more.